Imagine being a respected judge, driving through your own neighborhood, only to be pulled over by a cop who instantly assumes you've stolen your own car. What would you do if, despite your authority and accomplishments, you were treated like a criminal simply because of your race? And when the truth finally comes out, how do you think the officer will react when they realize who you truly are? This shocking story will make you question how often this happens and what it takes for justice to truly prevail. Before we begin this heartfelt story, let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from today, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. Judge Lucas brushed a speck of dust off the dashboard of his brand new Lexus. It was only a week old, but he already treated it like a prized possession. The leather seats had barely lost their factory shine, and the smooth purr of the engine gave him a sense of satisfaction that felt almost tangible. He had just come from his office at the courthouse, a long day behind him filled with back-to-back hearings, paperwork, and the weight of other people's problems. But this drive down the wide, tree-lined streets of Winterdale, Michigan was his favorite part of the day. It allowed him a moment to decompress and feel in control again. The calm streets, with their grand, sprawling homes set back from the road, were a sharp contrast to the tension that often followed him at work. But the momentary peace in his mind didn't last long. Just as Judge Lucas started humming along with the smooth rhythm of the jazz on the radio, flashing blue and red lights pierced the evening calm. He glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the unmistakable sight of a police cruiser tailing him. His heart skipped a beat, and his fingers instinctively tightened around the steering wheel. He pulled over without hesitation, confused but compliant. The neighborhood was quiet, far from the chaos of city life, and Judge Lucas hadn't been speeding, he knew that much. In fact, he'd been driving under the limit, enjoying the leisurely drive home after a long week. So, what could he have possibly done wrong? A sharp rap on the window cut through his thoughts. He turned to find a tall, broad-shouldered officer peering down at him, her face unreadable, her hand resting conspicuously close to the gun holstered at her side. "License and registration," she barked without the courtesy of a greeting. Judge Lucas complied silently, reaching into the glove compartment to retrieve his documents. The officer, her nameplate reading Officer Carter, snatched the papers from his hands without so much as a glance in his direction. She scanned the papers, her eyes narrowing as they darted back and forth between the documents and Judge Lucas himself. "Step out of the car," she ordered. Judge Lucas blinked. "Excuse me?" "Out now," she repeated, her voice harder this time, leaving no room for argument. Judge Lucas hesitated for a moment, his mind racing to comprehend what was happening. He was a judge, a respected one at that. In fact, he had presided over cases that likely involved Officer Carter's own department. He was on familiar ground in Winterdale, a place where he knew people, where he was known, and yet here he was, being treated like a suspect. "Ma'am, there must be some misunderstanding. I'm Judge Lucas, this is my car, and I live just down the street," he explained, keeping his tone measured. Officer Carter raised an eyebrow, her hand shifting ever so slightly toward her gun. "And step out now?" Swallowing the rising wave of indignation, Judge Lucas complied. He wasn't going to make things worse, not here, not now. He opened the door and stepped out, standing beside his car, as Officer Carter eyed him with a look that sent a chill down his spine. She walked around him slowly, as if sizing him up. "I've had reports of a vehicle like this stolen last week," she said, her eyes fixed on him as though he'd confessed to the crime himself. Judge Lucas's jaw tightened. "This is my car. I purchased it from the dealership a few days ago. If you run the plates, it will come back clean." She didn't seem to hear him, or maybe she didn't care. "Hands on the hood," she snapped, stepping toward him. "This is unnecessary," Judge Lucas protested, his patience fraying at the edges. "I've done nothing wrong." Officer Carter's eyes glinted with something he couldn't quite place. Was it suspicion or something more sinister? "You're going to do as I say or we'll have a problem," she said, her voice hard and unyielding. Judge Lucas's blood ran hot, but he reminded himself to stay calm. He wasn't just anyone. He knew how to handle situations like this. He knew his rights and he knew the law. Yet, despite everything he'd worked for, everything he'd achieved, it felt as though none of that mattered right now. With a deep breath, Judge Lucas complied. Placing his hands on the hood of the car, he felt the eyes of the nearby residents on him, curtains twitching as neighbors peeked out to watch the spectacle unfolding in front of them. The humiliation stung more than anything else. He had worked his entire life to rise above moments like these, to prove himself to be respected. But here he was, being reduced to a common suspect in front of the people he lived among. Officer Carter began patting him down roughly, her movements brusque and devoid of any respect. "We've had reports of car thieves in the area," she said. "This vehicle matches the description of one stolen last week." Judge Lucas clenched his jaw. "I already told you this car was purchased a few days ago. If you'll allow me to explain—" "Save it for the station," she interrupted, reaching for her handcuffs. Judge Lucas's heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to speak calmly. "Clearly, Officer Carter, I suggest you call your superior before you make a decision you'll regret." Her hand hovered above the cuffs. "You expect me to believe that?" Judge Lucas looked her in the eye, unwavering. "I expect you to verify my identity and do your job properly." Something shifted in her expression, just a flicker of uncertainty. Her confidence wavered and she took a step back with a huff of frustration. She reached for her radio and muttered into it, keeping her gaze locked on James. The minutes that followed felt like an eternity. James stood there, hands still on the car, while Officer Taylor kept glancing between him and her radio, waiting for confirmation. The air between them crackled with tension, and James couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Neighbors still peeked from behind their curtains, witnessing his humiliation. Finally, the radio crackled to life. "Taylor, stand down immediately. Judge Carter is a respected member of the community. I'm on my way." James straightened, feeling a surge of relief, but the damage had already been done. His dignity had been tarnished, and no amount of apologies could erase the humiliation he'd endured. Officer Taylor's face flushed with embarrassment as she lowered her radio. She hesitated for a moment, then muttered, "I'm sorry, Your Honor. There seems to have been a misunderstanding." James adjusted his jacket, his composure regained, though the anger still simmered beneath the surface. "A misunderstanding?" he echoed, his voice calm but firm. "That's what we're calling racial profiling now, officer?" Before she could respond, another police car pulled up, and a tall man with graying hair stepped out. Captain Thomas, head of the local precinct, approached with an air of urgency. "Judge Carter," he called out as he approached, his expression grave, "I can't begin to apologize enough for this incident. Rest assured, we'll get to the bottom of it." James nodded, but his mind was already racing with the implications of what had just happened. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the countless others who had been wrongly accused, harassed, or profiled. And now, as he stood there with Captain Thomas offering his apologies, James made a decision that would change the course of his life and the lives of many others. "Captain," James said, his voice steady and authoritative, "I'd like to speak with you and Officer Taylor, not as a victim, but as someone who believes we can turn this incident into an opportunity for real change." Captain Thomas looked taken aback by the request, but there was respect in his eyes. "Of course, Your Honor, whatever you need." James nodded and glanced around at the neighborhood, the quiet street, the houses with their curtains still drawn. He had worked too hard to be reduced to this, to be seen as nothing more than a suspect, as a threat. But he also knew that moments like this could become something more. They could be the catalyst for growth, for understanding, for change. As they walked toward Captain Thomas's car, James couldn't help but wonder if this moment, this public humiliation, could be the start of something bigger. Could this be the spark that ignited real conversations about the system, about justice, about what it meant to be truly seen for who you were, not the color of your skin? Little did he know, this was only the beginning of a journey that would challenge everything he thought he knew about justice, prejudice, and the power of one person to make a difference. James stood in his home later that evening, the familiar comfort of the space offering little relief from the weight pressing down on him. The encounter with Officer Taylor replayed in his mind, every detail sharp, every word echoing like a warning. He knew this wasn't a singular event. It wasn't about one mistake or one person. It was the result of something bigger, a system he thought he understood but now realized he was deeply entangled in, for better or worse. His wife, Denise, entered the room, sensing the tension in his posture even before he spoke. "James, what's wrong?" Denise's expression shifted from concern to anger. "This is unacceptable. You're a judge. They know you," she said. "And that's exactly the problem," Isaiah replied, his voice low but fierce. "It doesn't matter who I am or what I've achieved. In their eyes, I was just another black man driving a nice car in the wrong neighborhood. If it can happen to me, what does that say for the others who don't have the same resources, the same protection?" Denise shook her head, her frustration mirroring his. "This is ridiculous. Something has to change." Isaiah walked to the window, staring out at the perfectly manicured lawns and neatly parked cars. "I talked to the captain afterward," he said. "Suggested a program, something to teach these officers about what it's like for us on the other side of the badge. But it's not enough." Denise moved closer, her voice softening. "What are you going to do?" Isaiah turned toward her, his jaw set with determination. "I'm going to use this. I can't let this moment slip by. We've been complacent for too long. I want to sit down with Officer Rhodes, with the entire precinct, and show them what real justice looks like, not just for me, but for everyone." Denise smiled faintly, her eyes filled with both pride and worry. "I know you will, but be careful, Isaiah. These things, they don't change overnight. You'll be pushing against a lot of resistance." Isaiah nodded, knowing full well the truth in her words. "That's why it has to start now." The following week, Isaiah found himself standing before a group of police officers in a conference room at the Winterdale Police Department. The air in the room was thick with tension, as if the weight of past mistakes and unspoken accusations hovered just above their heads. Officer Rhodes sat among them, her face tight, her eyes flickering between discomfort and defiance. Isaiah could sense the battle going on inside her, whether to admit she had been wrong or to double down on the assumptions she had made. Captain Reynolds stood near the back, arms crossed, watching intently. Isaiah cleared his throat and began. "I'm not here to lecture anyone," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm here because I believe something needs to change. Last week, I was pulled over by one of your officers. It wasn't because I was speeding. It wasn't because I was breaking the law. It was because I was driving a nice car in a neighborhood where I apparently didn't look like I belonged." The room remained silent, but Isaiah could feel the discomfort growing. A few officers shifted in their seats. One or two glanced at Rhodes, who stared straight ahead, her face a mask of indifference. "I've spent my entire career working to uphold the law," Isaiah continued. "I've sat in courtrooms day after day, watching people's lives change with a single decision. I've worked hard to ensure that justice is served fairly and impartially. But last week, I was reminded that no matter how far you climb, no matter what title you hold, there are still some battles that you can't avoid." His gaze swept across the room, meeting the eyes of each officer, one by one. "This isn't about me. It's about the system. It's about the way we see each other. It's about the assumptions we make when we look at someone like me behind the wheel of a nice car." Isaiah could see a few heads nodding subtly, but most of the room remained stoic, the walls of defense firmly in place. "We can't change everything overnight," he said, echoing Denise's words, "but we can start small. We can start by having conversations like this, by challenging those assumptions, by understanding that every time you make a decision based on bias, you're not just hurting one person. You're hurting the community, the justice system, and the trust that's supposed to exist between us." Officer Rhodes finally spoke, her voice stiff. "I was just doing my job, sir. We had reports of a stolen car, and yours matched the description." Isaiah nodded, his expression calm. I understand that, officer. But when I told you who I was, when I offered to show you proof, you didn't listen. You assumed I was lying. That's the problem. It's not about following orders, it's about recognizing when those orders are flawed. The room fell silent again, the weight of his words sinking in. Captain Reynolds stepped forward, his voice quieter than before. We've all seen it, Judge Carr. We know the biases are there, but the question is, what do we do about them? Isaiah met his gaze. We start by acknowledging that they exist, and then we work together to dismantle them. There was a murmur of agreement in the room, and for the first time Isaiah felt like maybe, just maybe, they were starting to understand. It was a small step, but it was something. Weeks passed, and the tension from that meeting slowly began to fade. Officer Rhodes had agreed to shadow Isaiah in his courtroom, an offer he had extended to help bridge the gap between the badge and the bench. It wasn't easy at first. Her rigid demeanor and cool detachment were hard to break through, but Isaiah was patient. One afternoon, after watching him preside over a particularly difficult case involving a young black man falsely accused of assault, Rhodes finally broke her silence. I never realized how much of this is out of their control, she admitted quietly, standing beside Isaiah after the courtroom had emptied. Isaiah glanced at her, surprised by the vulnerability in her tone. What do you mean? Rhodes sighed, her shoulders sagging slightly. I mean, you hear things in the station, you see people brought in and you start to make assumptions. We're trained to follow protocols, but we're not trained to understand what happens after. I've been sitting here, watching these people's lives get torn apart by a system that's supposed to protect them. It's different when you see it up close. Isaiah nodded, his voice gentle. It's different when you live it. Rhodes looked down, her jaw clenched. I'm sorry for what happened that day. I really am. Isaiah didn't respond right away. He could sense the internal struggle she was going through. The process of unlearning was far more painful than anyone cared to admit. Apologies are a good start, he finally said. But what really matters is what you do next. Rhodes nodded slowly. I know, and I want to do better. I want to understand. Isaiah smiled, a small flicker of hope sparking inside him. That's all I can ask for. A month later, Winterdale found itself the subject of national headlines. A local contractor, Apex Builders, had been exposed for running unsafe construction sites and bribing city officials to overlook violations. The story was big enough on its own, but what made it even more explosive was the involvement of high-ranking officers within the Winterdale Police Department, some of whom had been complicit in covering up the company's wrongdoings. Isaiah had heard whispers of the scandal before it broke wide open. He'd been presiding over a few cases related to the construction company and had started piecing things together. But the full extent of the corruption didn't hit him until one late evening when his phone buzzed with a message from Aaron, a detective he'd known for years. We need to talk. Urgent. Isaiah met Aaron at a quiet diner on the edge of town. It was nearly deserted, just a few late-night patrons hunched over cups of coffee. Aaron slid into the booth across from Isaiah, his face etched with worry. What's going on? Isaiah asked, his voice low. Aaron glanced around, then leaned in. Apex Builders. They're in deep with some people at the top of the department. Bribes, falsified reports, you name it, and it's bigger than we thought. Isaiah frowned. How big are we talking? Aaron hesitated, then spoke in a whisper. I think the chief's involved, maybe even the mayor. Isaiah felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't just a simple case of a few bad actors. This was systemic, and it reached further than he'd ever imagined. Aaron continued, his voice tense. They've been trying to silence people. Some of the officers who were involved have been burying complaints, and now that the story's breaking, they're scrambling to cover their tracks. Isaiah leaned back in his seat, the weight of the situation settling in. Why are you telling me this? Because you're the only one I trust. Aaron said, his gaze steady. "And because I need your help, you're in a position to do something about this, to make sure the truth comes out." Isaiah nodded slowly, his mind already racing with the implications of what Aaron was saying. If the corruption went as high as Aaron suspected, then this wasn't just a local issue. It was a threat to the entire community's trust in its leadership. "All right," Isaiah said finally. "I'll help, but we need to be careful. If they're willing to cover up this much, they won't hesitate to go after anyone who gets in their way." Aaron nodded grimly. "I know. That's why we have to move fast." Isaiah spent the next few days quietly gathering evidence, reviewing court records and complaints that had been dismissed without cause. The deeper he dug, the more he realized just how entangled the police department was with Apex builders. Payments off the record, meetings, and falsified reports pointed to a web of corruption that threatened to ensnare anyone who got too close. And it wasn't just about money. It was about power, control, and the unchecked authority that allowed those in charge to act without consequence. Late one night, as Isaiah pored over documents in his home office, his phone buzzed again. Another message from Aaron. "They know, be careful." Isaiah's pulse quickened. He had known this was a possibility, that the more he uncovered, the more dangerous things would become. But seeing those words in front of him made it all the more real. He stared at the message from Aaron, the words burning into his mind. "They know, be careful." He leaned back in his chair, the silence of the house pressing in around him. Outside, the wind stirred the branches of the large oak tree in his front yard, its leaves rustling softly, a stark contrast to the storm brewing in his life. He had to be smart about this. It wasn't just his reputation on the line anymore, it was his life. The more he uncovered about Apex builders and the police department, the more dangerous things became. Aaron had made it clear that they were running out of time, and now that those in power knew what he was digging into, Isaiah had no doubt they would try to silence him before he got too close. He glanced at the clock. It was nearing midnight and the house was quiet save for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards settling. Denise had already gone to bed, but Isaiah was too wired to sleep. His mind raced with the implications of what he'd discovered and the possible consequences that were coming his way. He needed more evidence, something concrete that would blow this whole thing wide open. But he couldn't do it alone. He needed people he could trust, people who would stand by him when things got messy, and he knew exactly who to call. The next morning, Isaiah met with Aaron again, this time in a small park on the outskirts of town. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the grass, and the air was crisp with the promise of fall. Aaron was already there when Isaiah arrived, pacing by a bench, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Thanks for coming," Aaron said, shaking Isaiah's hand as he sat down. "I don't have much time, but we need to talk strategy." Isaiah nodded, scanning the park for any signs of unwelcome visitors. "How bad is it?" "Worse than I thought," Aaron admitted, running a hand through his hair. "I've been keeping my head down, but I've heard enough to know that they're onto us. They've been watching me, too. We don't have much time." Isaiah leaned forward, lowering his voice. "We need to get our hands on the internal police records, everything related to Apex builders and any communications between the officers involved. That's the only way we can expose them." Aaron nodded. "I've been working on that. There's a chance I can get into the department's database, but it's risky. If anyone catches wind of what I'm doing, it's over, for both of us." Isaiah sighed, rubbing his temples. He knew the stakes, but he couldn't turn back now. Too many people's lives had already been damaged by this corruption. He had to see it through, no matter the cost. "Let's be smart about this," Isaiah said. "We'll keep our circle small. You, me, and maybe one or two more people we can trust. We'll need all the evidence we can get, and once we have it, we'll go public. The media, the Attorney General's office, someone outside this town who can't be bought." Aaron nodded again, his eyes hard with determination. I'll get started on it tonight. But we need to be ready for anything, Isaiah. If they find out we're going public, they'll come after us with everything they've got." Isaiah's jaw tightened. "I know, but they won't scare us off." Denise took a deep breath, her eyes filled with both pride and fear. "Just promise me you'll be careful. You have a family, Isaiah. We need you." Isaiah reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "I promise." The following week was a blur of covert meetings, late-night phone calls, and careful planning. Isaiah and Aaron worked tirelessly, gathering as much information as they could without drawing attention to themselves. They combed through old case files, reviewed court documents, and quietly spoke to a few key people who had connections to Apex builders. Every new piece of evidence they uncovered painted a clearer picture of the corruption that had infiltrated Winterdale. High-ranking officers in the police department had been receiving kickbacks from Apex builders in exchange for ignoring violations and falsifying reports. The company had been cutting corners, endangering the lives of its workers and the community, all while lining the pockets of those who were supposed to protect the town. Isaiah knew they were sitting on a powder keg, and all it would take was one spark to set it off. But he was ready. He had spent his life upholding the law, and now he was about to use that very law to take down the people who had abused it. One evening, Isaiah received a call from Aaron. "I've got it," Aaron said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The records, everything, payments, emails, phone calls. There's no denying it now." Isaiah felt a surge of adrenaline. "Where are you?" "I'm at the station," Aaron replied. "I'm printing everything out now. Meet me at the diner in 30 minutes. Isaiah hung up the phone, his heart racing. This was it. They had what they needed. With this evidence, they could blow the whole thing open, expose everyone involved, and bring them to justice. But as he grabbed his keys and headed out the door, a nagging feeling of unease settled in his gut. He couldn't shake the sense that something was about to go wrong. Isaiah arrived at the diner a few minutes early. The dim lights cast long shadows across the empty booths. The waitress behind the counter gave him a nod, recognizing him from his previous visits, but otherwise paid him little attention. He sat in a booth near the back, his eyes scanning the parking lot through the large front window. Ern was supposed to be here by now, but there was no sign of him. Isaiah's phone buzzed. A message from Ern. "On my way, 5 minutes." He tapped his fingers on the table, his nerves on edge. The diner was quiet, almost too quiet. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second dragging on longer than the last. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Still no sign of Aaron. Isaiah's phone buzzed again, another message from Aaron, but this one made his blood run cold. "They're on to me. Get out." Before Isaiah could react, the door to the diner swung open and 2 men in dark suits walked in. Their eyes immediately locked onto him. They didn't look like locals, and the way they moved with purpose told Isaiah everything he needed to know. He was in danger. Isaiah stood up, his heart pounding in his chest. The men walked toward him, their expressions unreadable. "Judge Carr," one of them said, his voice cold and authoritative. "We need to have a word." Isaiah backed away, his mind racing. He knew exactly what they wanted, and he wasn't about to let them silence him. Without another word, Isaiah bolted for the back door, his feet pounding against the tile floor as he raced toward the exit. The men shouted after him, their footsteps close behind, but Isaiah didn't stop. He couldn't stop. He burst through the back door and into the alley, the cool night air hitting him like a slap in the face. His heart hammered in his chest as he sprinted toward his car, parked just around the corner. As he reached for the door handle, a hand clamped down on his shoulder, yanking him back. Isaiah spun around, his fists clenched, ready to fight. But before he could throw a punch, a familiar voice stopped him cold. "Isaiah, it's me." It was Aaron, his face pale and drenched in sweat. "We've got to go, now." Isaiah didn't ask questions. He jumped into the car and Aaron followed, slamming the door shut behind him. "They know everything," Aaron said, his voice breathless as he glanced nervously out the window. "We've been compromised." Isaiah's hands tightened around the steering wheel. "What do we do now?" Aaron looked at him, his eyes filled with desperation. "We need to go public tonight." Isaiah drove in silence, the city lights blurring past them as they sped toward the one place where they could expose the truth without interference, the local news station. Aaron sat beside him, his breathing ragged as he clutched a folder filled with the evidence they had worked so hard to collect. "This is it," Aaron said quietly, as if trying to convince himself as much as Isaiah. "Once we get this out there, there's no turning back." Isaiah nodded, his jaw set in determination. "I know, but we have no other choice." They arrived at the station just after midnight. The building was eerily quiet, except for a few late-night employees working the graveyard shift. Isaiah and Aaron made their way inside, flashing their IDs at the security guard, who barely glanced at them before waving them through. Once inside, they were directed to the studio, where the late-night news broadcast was being prepared. The producer, a sharp-eyed woman named Lisa Chen, greeted them with a raised eyebrow. "What brings a judge and a detective here at this hour?" she asked, her tone skeptical. Isaiah didn't waste time. "We have evidence of widespread corruption in the police department and city government. We need to go on air now." Lisa crossed her arms, clearly not convinced. "Do you have proof?" Aaron handed her the folder, his hands trembling slightly. "Everything's in here, names, dates, payments. It's all there." Lisa flipped through the papers, her eyes widening as she scanned the contents. She glanced up at Isaiah, her expression serious. "You realize what you're asking for, right? Once this airs, it's going to blow up. There'll be consequences for you, for everyone involved." Isaiah nodded, his voice steady. "We know, but this needs to be done." Lisa Chen studied the folder Aaron had handed her for what felt like an eternity. Isaiah watched her eyes skim over the documents, her face betraying the realization of just how deep this corruption ran. After a few tense moments, she finally closed the folder and looked back at the two men in front of her. The weight of the decision hung heavy in the air. "All right," she said quietly, nodding. "We'll do it." Isaiah and Aaron exchanged a look of relief, but they knew it was only the beginning. Once this went public, the fallout would be immediate and brutal. Those who had orchestrated the corruption wouldn't go down without a fight, and they would do everything in their power to stop the truth from coming out. Lisa led them into the studio where the late-night news team was preparing for the broadcast. The anchor, a calm-faced man named Jeff Lawson, was sitting at his desk, flipping through notes when Lisa approached him. "Jeff, we're going live with this," she said, placing the folder on the desk. "This is bigger than anything we've ever covered before." Jeff looked up at her, his brow furrowing as he opened the folder. He read the first few lines, then looked back up at Isaiah and Aaron, his expression hardening. "This is real?" he asked. "Every word of it," Isaiah said, his voice steady, "and we need to tell the public before it's too late." Jeff took a deep breath and nodded. "All right, we'll get ready." The clock ticked closer to midnight as the team scrambled to prepare for the broadcast. Cameras were adjusted, lights were fixed, and Isaiah and Aaron were ushered into makeup to cover the exhaustion and tension etched into their faces. As the final preparations were made, Isaiah felt a sense of both dread and resolve settle over him. This was the moment they had been building toward, the moment when everything they had worked for would either succeed or crumble. The power that came with the truth felt heavy, but Isaiah knew that it was necessary. He couldn't turn back now. The countdown to the live broadcast began. Isaiah sat next to Aaron under the bright studio lights, their faces reflected on the monitors scattered around the room. The air was thick with tension as the seconds ticked down, and Isaiah could hear his own heartbeat in his ears. Jeff Lawson took his place at the anchor desk, his expression serious as he shuffled his notes. The camera light blinked red, signaling they were about to go live. "In 5, 4, 3... The producer's voice counted down. Jeff looked into the camera, his voice calm but filled with gravity. "Good evening. We interrupt your regular programming for a special report." Isaiah could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. There was no turning back now. This was it. The broadcast began with a brief introduction of Isaiah and Aaron outlining their roles and credentials. Jeff then turned the floor over to them, his voice steady as he introduced the topic. Tonight, we bring you a story that will shake the very foundation of this community. Corruption, bribery, and the abuse of power have infiltrated the highest levels of our local government and police department. With me tonight is Judge Isaiah Carr and Detective Aaron Walker, who have uncovered a web of criminal activity that has gone unchecked for years. Isaiah cleared his throat, his voice calm but filled with purpose. What we have uncovered is evidence of widespread corruption within the Winterdale Police Department and Apex Builders, a local construction company that has been involved in illegal activities for years. Officers, including high-ranking officials, have accepted bribes to cover up safety violations, falsify reports, and silence those who speak out. The camera cut to Aaron, who elaborated on the details of the investigation. We have evidence of payments made to officers in exchange for looking the other way. The corruption runs deep, and it's clear that the leadership within both the police department and local government has been complicit in these crimes. Isaiah's heart raced as he spoke, the weight of the truth crashing down on him with every word, but he remained steady, determined to see this through. For too long, this corruption had gone unchecked, Isaiah continued. But tonight we are bringing this to light. We have the documents, the proof, and we are sharing it with the public. This is not just about one company or one department. This is about justice, about holding those in power accountable for their actions. The broadcast lasted less than 30 minutes, but by the time it ended, the studio was buzzing with activity. Phones were ringing off the hook, social media was exploding with reactions, and Isaiah could feel the shift in the air. The truth was out there now, and there was no way to stop it. But as the team wrapped up, Isaiah's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw a message from an unknown number. "You shouldn't have done that. Now you've made it personal." His stomach dropped. He knew what this meant. The people they had exposed wouldn't just sit quietly while their empire crumbled. They would come for him, for Aaron, for anyone involved in this broadcast. The fight was far from over. Isaiah quickly showed Aaron the message, and Aaron's face darkened. "They're coming." Isaiah nodded, his voice steady but filled with tension. "We need to be ready." The days that followed were a blur of chaos. The story spread like wildfire, reaching not just Winterdale but surrounding cities, and even the state capital. The news of widespread corruption rocked the community, and within hours of the broadcast, protests had already begun outside the police station and city hall. Isaiah and Aaron were thrust into the spotlight, their names now synonymous with the fight for justice in Winterdale. But with that recognition came danger. The threats against them intensified. Anonymous messages, late-night phone calls, and strange cars parked outside their homes became a regular occurrence. Isaiah had expected backlash, but not like this. It wasn't just his career or reputation at risk anymore. It was his family's safety. Denise was worried. Her normally calm demeanor was now tinged with fear. She tried to hide it, but Isaiah could see the strain in her eyes, the way she jumped at the slightest noise. "You should go to the police," Denise said one night, as they sat at the kitchen table, their dinner untouched in front of them. Isaiah shook his head. "I can't. They're part of this. We can't trust anyone on the inside." Denise sighed, her hands trembling as she reached for her glass of water. "So what do we do?" Isaiah clenched his fists. "We stay strong. We keep pushing. We've exposed them and now they're scared. They want us to back down, but we can't." Denise's eyes filled with tears and she reached for his hand. "I just don't want to lose you." "Isaiah, promise me you'll be careful." Isaiah squeezed her hand gently. "I promise." Meanwhile, Aaron had taken to staying in a motel on the outskirts of town, keeping a low profile while they waited for the dust to settle. He knew they had stirred up a hornet's nest, and it was only a matter of time before things escalated. One night, as Aaron sat in his dingy motel room, his phone buzzed with a call. He answered it expecting another threat, but instead it was Lisa Chen from the news station. "Aaron, I just got word from one of my sources," Lisa said, her voice tense. "There's a warrant out for your arrest." Aaron froze. "What? What are they accusing me of?" "Tampering with evidence in a previous case." She explained. "It's a setup, Aaron. They're coming for you." Aaron's heart pounded in his chest. He knew this was coming, but it still hit him like a punch to the gut. They were trying to discredit him, to silence him before he could do any more damage. "Thanks for the heads up, Lisa," Aaron said, his voice tight. "I'll figure something out." He hung up the phone, his mind racing. They were closing in on him, and if he didn't act fast, it would be too late. He couldn't let them win. Not now, not after everything they had uncovered. Aaron quickly packed his things and slipped out of the motel room, his eyes scanning the parking lot for any sign of danger. He had to move fast, but he couldn't stay in hiding forever. He needed to find a way to fight back. The next morning, Isaiah received a call from Aaron. His friend's voice was strained, the weight of the situation clearly taking its toll. "They're after me," Aaron said. "I've got a warrant out for my arrest." Isaiah's heart sank. "For what?" "Tampering with evidence." "It's all fabricated, Isaiah. They're trying to take me down." Isaiah gritted his teeth, his mind racing. "Where are you?" "On the move," Aaron replied. "I can't stay in one place too long, but we need to do something. They're trying to make us disappear, make this all go away." Liza nodded, already formulating a plan. "We'll fight this, Aaron, but we need more than just what we've got. We need someone higher up, someone who can blow this wide open." There was a pause on the other end of the line, then Aaron spoke again, his voice low. "There's one more thing, Isaiah. Something I didn't tell you." Isaiah's brow furrowed. "What is it?" "I got a tip from someone inside," Iran said. "There's more going on here than just corruption. Apex Builders, they've been involved in something bigger, and it's connected to the police department. It's not just about covering up violations, it's about controlling the town." Isaiah felt a chill run down his spine. "What are you talking about?" "There's a network, Isaiah. A web of people who've been running this town from the shadows for years. Apex Builders is just the front. The real power lies with the people pulling the strings, and they'll do anything to keep it that way." Isaiah's grip on the phone tightened. "Who's behind it?" "I don't know yet," Aaron admitted, "but I'm going to find out. I just need time." Isaiah's mind raced. This was bigger than he'd ever imagined. It wasn't just about corrupt officers or a shady construction company. It was about something far more dangerous, something that could destroy everything they had worked for. "Be careful, Aaron," Isaiah said, his voice heavy with concern. "We're in deep now." "I know," Aaron replied, "but we're not backing down." Isaiah hung up the phone, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. What Aaron had just told him changed everything. If Apex Builders was just a front for something bigger, then the corruption went far deeper than they had suspected. And now, Aaron was in hiding with a fabricated arrest warrant hanging over his head. Isaiah stood in the center of his living room, the soft glow of the lamp casting long shadows on the walls. Denise entered quietly, sensing the storm brewing inside him. "What is it?" she asked gently, concern etched across her face. Isaiah sighed, running a hand over his face. "It's worse than we thought, Denise." Aaron uncovered more. "Apex Builders is just the tip of the iceberg. There's a whole network of people running this town, and they're pulling the strings from the shadows." Denise's eyes widened, her hand covering her mouth. "Isaiah, what are you going to do?" He met her gaze, his jaw set with determination. "I don't know yet, but I can't back down. Not now." Denise stepped closer, taking his hands in hers. "You're not alone in this. Just be careful, please." Isaiah nodded, his heart heavy with both fear and resolve. He pulled her into a tight embrace, drawing strength from her warmth, from the love they shared. He knew this battle was far from over, but he also knew that he couldn't stop fighting. not until justice was served. The next morning, Isaiah sat in his office, staring at the documents spread out before him. They had enough evidence to expose the corruption in Winterdale, but now that Aaron had uncovered the deeper conspiracy, everything felt much more dangerous. If there were powerful figures behind Apex Builders, they would stop at nothing to keep their secrets buried. Isaiah picked up the phone and dialed the number of an old friend, someone he hadn't spoken to in years but knew could help. After a few rings, a familiar voice answered. "Isaiah Carr, long time," Joseph said. "I need your help," Isaiah said, cutting straight to the point. Joseph was an attorney who had worked in the state's attorney general's office. They had crossed paths several times over the years, but this was different. Isaiah was calling in a favor. Joseph's tone shifted. "What's going on?" "I've uncovered something big. Corruption in the police department, bribes, falsified reports. It's all connected to a local construction company, but it goes deeper. I need someone who can take this to the highest level, someone I can trust." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, then Joseph spoke again, his voice low. "You're serious about this?" "I wouldn't be calling you if I wasn't." "All right," Joseph said. "Send me what you have. I'll take a look and see what we can do. But Isaiah, be careful. You're playing with fire." Isaiah nodded, knowing full well the risks. "I know, but this needs to be done." Days passed, and the tension in Winterdale only grew. The protests outside the police station and city hall intensified, with more and more people demanding answers. The broadcast had sparked a firestorm, and there was no putting it out. But the threats against Isaiah and Aaron also escalated. Anonymous phone calls, strange cars parked outside their homes. Everything felt like a ticking time bomb, and now that Aaron was in hiding, Isaiah felt the weight of the fight on his shoulders. He spent every waking moment reviewing the evidence, working with Joseph to build a case that would expose the full extent of the corruption. But the more he dug, the more dangerous things became. One evening, as Isaiah was leaving the courthouse, a black SUV pulled up beside him. The tinted window rolled down, revealing a man in a suit with a cold, calculating gaze. "Judge Carr," the man said, his voice smooth, "a word of advice. Walk away while you still can." Isaiah's heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't flinch. "I'm not walking away." The man smiled, though there was no warmth in it. "That's unfortunate." "You're making this personal." Isaiah clenched his fists. "This is about justice, and I'm not afraid of you." The man's smile faded and his gaze hardened. "You should be." Without another word, the window rolled up, and the SUV sped off, leaving Isaiah standing alone on the street, his pulse racing. Isaiah knew he couldn't wait any longer. The people behind Apex Builders weren't going to let this go quietly, and now that they had made their threats personal, he needed to act fast. That night he met with Joseph and Lisa Chen, the news producer who had helped them air the original broadcast. They gathered in a small conference room, poring over the documents and planning their next move. "We have everything we need," Joseph said, his voice steady. "The evidence is airtight. We'll take this to the state's attorney general's office tomorrow morning. Once this goes public, there's no going back." Isaiah nodded, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. "Let's do it." But just as they were about to leave the room, Isaiah's phone buzzed. It was a message from Aaron. "I've got the final piece. Meet me at the old warehouse on 5th Street. Isaiah's stomach twisted. The warehouse on 5th Street was a rundown, abandoned building on the outskirts of town. It was the last place anyone would want to meet, especially in the middle of the night. He showed the message to Joseph and Lisa, his voice tense. "Aaron wants to meet. He says he has the final piece." Joseph frowned. It could be a trap. Isaiah shook his head. "No, it's Aaron. I trust him." Lisa nodded, though her expression was tight with concern. "Then let's go, but we need to be careful." Isaiah, Joseph, and Lisa arrived at the warehouse just before midnight. The building was dark and looming, its windows shattered and its walls covered in graffiti. The wind howled through the empty streets, adding to the sense of unease that hung in the air. They parked the car a few blocks away and approached the warehouse on foot, their footsteps echoing on the cracked pavement. Isaiah's heart raced as they stepped inside, the darkness swallowing them whole. He scanned the empty space, searching for any sign of Aaron. "Aaron?" he called out, his voice bouncing off the walls. For a moment there was only silence, but then from the shadows a figure emerged. It was Aaron, his face pale and strained. He clutched a folder in his hand, his eyes darting around nervously. "I've got it," Aaron said, his voice shaky. "The final piece, the connection between Apex Builders and the police department. It's all here." Isaiah felt a wave of relief wash over him. "Let's see it." But before Aaron could hand over the folder, the sound of footsteps echoed through the warehouse. Isaiah's heart skipped a beat as he turned toward the entrance, his pulse quickening. From the shadows, a group of men appeared. Dark suits, cold expressions. The same men who had threatened Isaiah outside the courthouse. "You should have listened, Judge Carr," one of the men said, his voice low and menacing. Isaiah's heart pounded in his chest as he stepped in front of Aaron, shielding him from the men. "You're too late, the truth is already out." The man smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "We'll see about that." Before Isaiah could react, one of the men lunged toward Aaron, grabbing the folder from his hands. Aaron struggled, but the men were too strong. They tore the folder from his grasp, scattering the papers across the floor. Isaiah's blood boiled as he rushed forward, but one of the men shoved him back, sending him crashing into a wall. "Enough," the man growled. "You've caused enough trouble." But just as they were about to make their escape, the sound of sirens pierced the air. Flashing blue and red lights flooded the warehouse, and the men froze. "Drop it!" a voice shouted. It was Lisa, standing in the doorway, a police officer by her side. The men hesitated for a moment, but then, one by one, they dropped the folder and raised their hands. Isaiah's heart raced as the police moved in, handcuffing the men and escorting them out of the warehouse. He rushed to Aaron's side, helping him to his feet. "You okay?" Isaiah asked, his voice breathless. Aaron nodded, though his face was pale. "Yeah, thanks." Isaiah glanced at the scattered papers on the floor, relief flooding through him. "We did it." The fallout from the arrests was swift and brutal. The evidence they had uncovered was enough to bring down not just Apex Builders, but several high-ranking officials in the Winterdale Police Department and local government. The town was rocked by the scandal, and for the first time in years, people began to see just how deep the corruption had gone. Isaiah and Aaron were hailed as heroes, though neither of them felt particularly heroic. They had done what needed to be done, but the cost had been high. They had put everything on the line, and though justice had been served, the scars would remain. But there was a sense of hope now, hope that things would change, that the town could rebuild, that the system could be reformed. A few weeks later, Isaiah stood on the steps of the courthouse, looking out over the town he had fought so hard to protect. The air was crisp, and the sun was just beginning to rise, casting a warm glow over the streets. Denise joined him, slipping her hand into his. "How do you feel?" Denise asked. Isaiah took a deep breath, his heart full, like we're just getting started. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of everything they had been through hanging between them, but there was also a sense of peace now, a sense of purpose. Isaiah had always believed in the law, in the power of justice, and though the fight had been long and hard, he knew that it had been worth it. Because in the end, justice had prevailed. And that was all that mattered.